Flight attendant shouts at a black woman, then she makes one call, and the entire flight is canceled. The aircraft was soaring at 30,000 feet when the flight attendant made an unexpected decision. She strolled down the aisle, halted beside a composed, elegantly dressed black woman in first class, and insisted that she vacate her seat. The woman, bewildered, held the correct ticket for her assigned seat, yet the attendant remained resolute. What transpired next was astonishing. With a single phone call, the woman took an action that no one anticipated. The entire flight was abruptly canceled, and everything shifted in a heartbeat. Stay tuned to discover how a seemingly simple situation unfolded. An error transformed into a disaster for the crew. Before we proceed, share your predictions in the comments about what might unfold next. Also, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible videos. Carol Williams was eagerly anticipating her flight from New York to Los Angeles. The stress of the previous week had worn her out, but she was resolute in seeking tranquility during the trip. She boarded the plane with a composed assurance, clad in a stylish black blazer and a chic white dress, her natural curls elegantly framing her face, and she carried her leather bag with an aura of understated professionalism. The flight attendant offered a polite smile as she walked by, and Carrara nodded in response, not overly engaged in the casual conversation. She was aware that the first-class section was her rightful place. She had secured her ticket well ahead of time, and everything was in perfect order. As she approached her seat near the front of the plane, a friendly passenger welcomed her. Following a brief exchange, Carrara settled into her seat and stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, then retrieved her small. With her notebook and pen in hand, Carrara was determined to maximize her time. The gentle hum of the engines and the soft murmur of fellow passengers created a backdrop as she began to jot down ideas for her project. Her concentration was unwavering, exuding a serene demeanor that suggested she was untouched by her surroundings. However, as she became more engrossed, one flight attendant, Rachel, who had dedicated years to the airline, noticed her focused effort and took pride in it. Herself on her capacity to maintain control in any situation, she strolled down the aisle, her eyes surveying the passengers for any signs of trouble. When her gaze fell upon Carrara, something about the woman piqued her interest. Rachel couldn't quite place it, but there was an air of calm confidence about her that seemed unusual for first class. Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, yet she continued walking. A few steps later, she hesitated and turned back, her gaze still locked on Kara. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her tone, with a courteous yet pointed tone. Rachel inquired, "May I see your boarding pass?" Kara, taken aback by the unexpected demand, maintained her composure and handed over the pass. "Of course," she replied, offering a small, polite smile. Rachel quickly scanned the boarding pass, her expression shifting to a slight frown. "This is for first class," she questioned, her voice tinged with skepticism. Kara nodded firmly, her tone unwavering as she affirmed, "Yes, that's correct." Despite Kara's confidence, Rachel's frown deepened, though her reasoning remained unclear. She returned the boarding pass silently, her lips pressed together. The brief interaction felt concluded, yet Rachel's expression hinted to Kara that it was not entirely over. As Kara turned back to her notebook, attempting to dismiss the rising tension, Rachel stepped aside to speak softly with another flight attendant, her gaze flickering back to Kara intermittently. Kara sensed the shift in the atmosphere, but chose not to respond. Instead, she redirected her attention to her work, wishing for the flight to continue smoothly. After a few moments without interruptions, Rachel came back, her demeanor now exuding a newfound authority. She approached Carrara once more, her expression more serious. "Miss Williams," she said, her tone firmer this time, "could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Kara blinked, momentarily surprised. She had never encountered issues with a boarding pass before. Nevertheless, she stood up without objection, taking her bag with her. The passengers around her exchanged curious glances, but Carrara's face remained composed as Rachel led the way to the galley, where the whispers intensified. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, yet no one had the courage to speak up. As they reached the narrow aisle adjacent to the galley, Rachel turned to Kara. I'm going to need you to move to a different seat, Rachel stated, arms crossed. There seems to be a mistake with your booking. Kara's brow knitted in confusion. A mistake? Her ticket had been confirmed, and she had no reason to suspect any problem. I don't think so, Kara replied, maintaining a calm tone. I booked this ticket weeks ago. It was confirmed. Could you double-check? Rachel's tone grew sharp, and for the first time a chill entered her voice. I already checked, she replied almost with disdain. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. You'll have to move to the main cabin. The words lingered and Carrara's stomach nodded in disbelief. I don't understand, Kara said, frustration seeping into her voice. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move? Rachel's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a whisper. I don't have time to explain, she said swiftly, nearly interrupting Kara. Either you move, or I'll have to call security for assistance. The words struck Kara like a tidal wave, but she masked her feelings. Taking a deep breath, she nodded once and quietly made her way back to her seat to collect her things. The entire cabin appeared to be observing her as she walked toward the rear of the plane, accompanied by Rachel. She sensed the gaze of the other passengers upon her. Some looked sympathetic, while others quickly averted their eyes, feigning ignorance of Kara's situation. She walked with her head held high, determined not to let the situation disrupt her poise. Upon reaching the main cabin, Rachel indicated an empty seat in the middle row. Carrara didn't protest. She settled into the seat, tucking her bag beneath the one in front of her. As she gazed out the window, her expression remained serene. Yet her mind was in turmoil. Frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. She sensed that something was amiss and felt compelled to take action. She retrieved her phone and started typing a message, her fingers flying across the screen. Glided across the screen as she hit send, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was time for a shift, and Kara was poised to take action. Leaning back in her seat, the drone of the plane served as a muted backdrop to the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her mind. Though she didn't outwardly react to the unfairness of being displaced from her seat, her tranquility was deliberate. While the other passengers in the cabin murmured and averted their gazes, Kara's attention remained fixed on the small screen before her. She wasn't upset. Rather, she was methodical. Her fingers danced swiftly across her phone as she crafted a brief yet clear message, designed to be precise with no room for misunderstanding. Once she hit send, a small, knowing smile graced her lips. There was no need for shouting or dramatics. Carrara understood that sometimes silence and composure wielded greater power than anything else. She tucked her phone back into her bag and adjusted her seat as if nothing had transpired. The tension in the air seemed to intensify, but Carrara remained utterly unfazed. Unfazed, the flight attendants carried on with their responsibilities, with one or two casting furtive looks in her direction, yet none were bold enough to approach her again. Meanwhile, Rachel remained in the first-class section, navigating her tasks with a veneer of confidence. The events of earlier replayed in her mind, but she dismissed them, convinced she had done nothing amiss. It was merely another routine scenario, she reassured herself. Yet there was an unsettling quality about Kara that she couldn't quite identify. Each time she stole a glance back at her, a sense of unease lingered. The main cabin was as serene as ever, with Carrara's expression remaining inscrutable. The flight proceeded without any disturbances for a while. Drinks were distributed, light conversations among passengers filled the atmosphere, and the flight attendants carried on with their tasks. Yet an unspoken tension lingered in the cabin, a quiet recognition that something felt amiss. Even Rachel couldn't dismiss the notion that this was more than just a random passenger who had erred in her booking. Carrara's calm demeanor only intensified the unease. Confidence radiated from Kara as she sat, her eyes occasionally darting to the front of the plane. She sensed a shift in the atmosphere, aware that it was only a matter of time before events began to unfold unexpectedly. Every subtle movement she made was purposeful, meticulously planned for the moment she would seize control. Meanwhile, Rachel navigated the cabin, her earlier assurance starting to wane. She stole one last glance at Kara, only to find her still absorbed in her notebook, seemingly oblivious. The world had not merely turned upside down. It was in that instant, amidst her daily routine, that Rachel's phone vibrated. She looked at it, and though she remained silent, her eyes grew wide. She stood there momentarily frozen, as a sense of dread began to creep up her spine. Something had dramatically changed, and she could sense it. Meanwhile, Kara remained still, her eyes serene while her mind raced. She was fully aware of the chain of events she had initiated. This was not just a minor setback for her, it marked the onset of something much larger. Already several steps ahead, Rachel remained unaware of the full extent of her error and had yet to grasp what was about to unfold. Minutes ticked by, and the cabin resumed its typical atmosphere. Passengers nestled into their seats, some engrossed in movies, others lost in books, while a few drifted off as the plane soared through the sky. However, Kara was not distracted by any of this. Her mind was sharp and methodical as she contemplated her next moves. The sensation of the air pressure shifting in the cabin felt almost reassuring, a reminder that she had everything under control. As Kara surveyed her surroundings, she observed several passengers exchanging whispers and casting furtive glances her way. She understood their curiosity regarding the earlier incident, but it didn't faze her. Her composure remained intact. Kara recognized that the true conflict extended beyond a mere seating error. It encompassed far more than her entitlement to the seat she had purchased. It was about the treatment she had endured, the assumptions made about her, and the newfound strength she was beginning to embrace. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to pretended as if everything was fine and made her way to the galley to inspect the drinks cart. Her usual calm was beginning to falter as thoughts of Kara consumed her. There was something disconcerting about the woman's tranquil demeanor, the way she had effortlessly acquiesced to Rachel's requests and then returned to her seat. Most people would have resisted, would have created a disturbance, would have made Rachel feel guilty. But not Kara. She had merely made a call and then fell silent. Rachel's stomach twisted with unease, yet she dismissed her concerns, reassuring herself that she was simply overthinking. After all, she had done nothing wrong. She was merely fulfilling her responsibilities. However, as she turned to face Kara and noticed the calmness in her eyes once more, a flicker of doubt began to surface. What if she had erred? What if Kara was more than just another inconsequential passenger? The tension in the atmosphere seemed to intensify, though no one voiced it. The flight attendants exchanged fleeting glances, but continued with their tasks undeterred. Meanwhile, Kara remained motionless, her gaze fixed intently on she gazed out the window at the bright, endless sky, her thoughts clearer and more concentrated than ever. She had already made her decision about what would come next. It was merely a question of waiting for the perfect moment. Suddenly, a soft beep resonated through the cabin as the intercom activated. The captain's voice crackled through, but this time it carried a gravity that was far from the usual announcements. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen." The captain's voice came through, steady yet authoritative. "We regret to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances, this flight will be canceled. Please remain seated as we prepare to land and manage the situation." The announcement hit the cabin like a shock wave, instantly altering the mood. Passengers exchanged bewildered glances. Some began to whisper, while others anxiously peered out the windows, uncertain of the unfolding events. However, Kara stayed composed, observing the chaos around her with a steady gaze. Her face lost all color as she turned toward the galley, her mind racing. Deep down, she understood that this was no coincidence. The flight cancellation, the palpable tension in the air, it was all intertwined, stemming from one simple, quiet call, Carrara's call. As Rachel's hands trembled slightly, she reached for the intercom. But before she could press the button, she noticed one of the other flight attendants, Anna Foster, walking by with a worried expression. Anna Foster had been among the few to recognize the odd dynamics between Rachel. As unease spread among the passengers, Kara had already taken action. She remained composed, avoiding any outbursts or chaos, understanding that true power often lies in subtlety. While Rachel observed the growing confusion, she sensed that something significant was unfolding. Unbeknownst to her, Kara was aware of the depths of the situation, and soon Rachel would discover just how far-reaching this seemingly minor error would prove to be. Her hands shook as she stood paralyzed, gazing out over the cabin. The news of the flight's cancellation reverberated in her thoughts, yet it felt incomprehensible. Nothing seemed to add up anymore. The passengers shifted restlessly in their seats. Some directed questions at the flight attendants, while others fixated on the illuminated seatbelt sign, as if seeking answers from the void. But no explanation came, and the harder Rachel attempted to make sense of it all, the clearer it became that every single detail led to an unsettling conclusion. Returning to Carrara. Kara had been the spark. Her composed and steady presence had transformed an ordinary flight into an unexpectedly tense experience. Now it felt as if an unusual, unvoiced pressure enveloped the entire plane. Rachel's thoughts raced as she recalled their initial encounter, when Kara had handed over her boarding pass without hesitation. Her courteous, yet assertive reply had left Rachel with lingering questions. What had she overlooked? What insights did Kara possess that Rachel did not? Meanwhile, Kara remained, sitting in serene silence, seemingly unaffected by the turmoil surrounding her. She observed the cabin crew as they hurried to address the bewildered passengers. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Carrara recognized that her scheme was unfolding flawlessly. She had initiated a series of events, but this was merely the start. The cancellation of the flight held no concern for her. It was merely a step toward her ultimate goal. The true influence lay in what was to follow. She shifted her posture, crossing her legs with graceful poise, a discreet yet commanding reminder of her control. She remained composed, the faint smile that had briefly graced her lips reappearing, a sense of quiet satisfaction blossoming within her. She was unshaken, not in the slightest. Kara had long understood that maintaining her calm in such moments was the most effective way to command attention without uttering a word. The storm was approaching, but she was prepared. The crew, however, was not. As Rachel navigated through the aisles, attempting to manage the chaos, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had made a significant error. She was accountable for this disruption. This chaos overwhelmed her, and she felt utterly lost on how to remedy it. The harder she fought to reclaim control, the more she understood that it was eluding her. "Is everything okay up here?" "Another flight attendant?" Mark Sullivan inquired as he entered the galley. His tone remained neutral, yet his eyes scanned Rachel's face for any hints of what had transpired. Rachel attempted to articulate her thoughts, but the words eluded her. How could she convey something she herself couldn't grasp? She could only muster a faint nod. "It's fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. "We're just figuring it out," she said. Mark Sullivan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he chose not to press the issue. He moved to the back of the plane, but before reaching the passengers, he cast one last look at Rachel. "You better hope you didn't mess with the wrong person," he muttered under his breath, the words lingering in the air. Rachel froze, his statement slicing through her thoughts like a sharp knife. She couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was profoundly amiss. But what could it be? She glanced at Carrara remained seated, her serene demeanor a striking contrast to the chaotic environment surrounding her. Rachel had initially thought she was merely another business traveler, someone who would blend into the background without causing a stir. However, that assumption now appeared to be a significant error. As time passed, the tension in the cabin intensified, and passengers began to whisper among themselves, exchanging confused looks as their impatience mounted with the announcement regarding the flight status. The cancellation began to weigh heavily on Rachel, intensifying her anxiety. She was unaccustomed to feeling so powerless and craved answers, yet no one had any to offer. The typical ease of the flight had been shattered by something much more significant than a mere seating problem. Kara was involved, and Rachel couldn't shake the unsettling thought that her previous choices might soon have consequences. Meanwhile, Kara remained unhurried, her thoughts already directed toward the next phase. She was aware that the wheels were turning, and soon her discreet plan would unfold. Unfold fully, this situation transcended her mere right to remain seated. It was about establishing a precedent and ensuring that this injustice would not fade into obscurity. She was leaving nothing to chance, and soon Rachel would come to understand the consequences of underestimating her. A storm was brewing, and Rachel was oblivious to how much more intense it would become. But Kara was ready. The minutes dragged on as the plane lingered in an unsettling stillness, while Rachel's thoughts spiraled in a chaotic whirlwind. At 2020, confusion and a rising sense of unease enveloped her. The certainty she once held had dissipated, replaced by a troubling realization that she had miscalculated the situation gravely. The passengers, now restless and murmuring, infused the cabin with an air of frustration. Yet it was more than mere irritation. There was an underlying sense that something was fundamentally amiss, an unspoken tension that left everyone feeling unsettled. Kara, however, remained perfectly still in her seat, her posture straight and composed, her eyes occasionally flickering toward the front of the plane. Yet she remained unfazed by the turmoil surrounding her. The tension in the cabin was palpable, but she felt no urgency to address it. She had initiated a series of events, and now it was simply a matter of time before the repercussions emerged. Her phone vibrated softly in her bag, a discreet indication that her choices were already affecting those who mattered. Meanwhile, Rachel stood at the front of the cabin, doing her best to reassure the passengers with as much confidence as she could muster. We're currently facing a delay, she stated, her voice strained. Please stay seated while we address the situation. However, the passengers appeared unconvinced. Some were already collecting their things, their impatience evident, while others whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at the flight attendants and sharing anxious looks. Rachel sensed their gaze upon her, but it wasn't as a flight attendant. They regarded her as if she were the cause of the issue. Her mind raced, yet nothing seemed to add up. Why was the flight canceled? What had transpired in those brief moments between Carrara's call and the announcement? She felt the heaviness of her choice pressing down on her, the weight of her actions becoming increasingly intolerable. The more she attempted to dismiss her thoughts, the more evident it became that Kara had orchestrated this, and Rachel had unknowingly played her role in it. As Rachel made her way down the aisle, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the passengers, she spotted Mark Sullivan standing near the galley, arms crossed, observing her with a blend of emotions. His eyes were keen, slicing through the fog of Rachel's distress. He didn't need to utter a word. His look conveyed everything. He sensed that something was amiss. You need to speak with the captain, Mark Sullivan said gently, his voice laced with caution. This is more significant than you understand. Rachel nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She was all too aware that things were spiraling out of control. As she made her way to the cockpit, her legs felt heavy, each step intensifying the dread that had settled in her stomach. The door to the cockpit opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside, immediately feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on her. Captain Robert Ellis, a seasoned professional, looked up from the controls. His face was calm, but an unmistakable tension lingered in his posture. He didn't need to ask, What happened, Rachel, at 11:30 p.m.? He inquired, his tone subdued yet resolute. I don't know, sir, Rachel responded, her voice wavering slightly. We've encountered a problem with one of the passengers. She was moved to economy, and then everything began to unravel. The flight got canceled. I don't know why. Captain Robert Ellis sighed, massaging his temples, his demeanor growing more severe. Which passenger are we discussing? Naomi Carter, Rachel answered, the name escaping her lips with an unexpected gravity. She recognized, only after speaking, the significant weight that the name held. The captain's gaze flickered at the mention of Carrara, causing her heart to race. Are you familiar with her? Captain Robert Ellis's voice cut through the air, his gaze steady and unyielding. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine, caught off guard by the intensity of his scrutiny. The unease in her stomach grew as she struggled to grasp the weight of his words. I thought she was just another passenger, Rachel stuttered, but the captain's expression revealed that her explanation fell short. He regarded her with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Rachel, Captain Robert Ellis began, spoke slowly, his tone becoming increasingly grave. You've just made a significant error, he said, leaning back in his seat, his expression hardening even more. Naomi Carter isn't just an ordinary passenger. She's linked to the airline's board of directors. You've just created an adversary with the influence to jeopardize this airline's reputation. Rachel felt her mouth go dry, and the color drained from her face as the reality of her mistake struck her with overwhelming force. Carrara was not merely another businesswoman. She was a figure of power, capable of bringing everything crashing down, and she had already taken action. The captain exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing. You better hope you haven't crossed a line you can't uncross, he warned, his words firm and his tone resolute. If she's behind this, we're facing serious consequences. You need to manage this situation carefully, Rachel. Very carefully. Rachel nodded, but her mind was racing. We're already in motion. She had acted on impulse, attempting to regain control, only to realize she had misjudged Carrara. The repercussions of that error were just starting to reveal themselves. Kara's composure had been the quiet before the tempest, and now Rachel sensed the storm approaching. Her thoughts raced as she exited the cockpit, her heart racing in her chest. It felt as though the ground beneath her was gradually giving way, each step dragging her deeper into a predicament from which she couldn't break free. Naomi Carter, the woman she had so effortlessly dismissed, wasn't merely another passenger. She was a formidable figure, someone with the influence to dismantle everything Rachel had built. The captain's words lingered ominously, reverberating in Rachel's mind. You better hope you haven't crossed a line you can't uncross. It felt as if the gravity of her error was finally sinking in, and she couldn't shake it off. What had she been thinking? How could she have treated Kara in such a manner? The persistent doubts that had begun as mere whispers now loomed larger. The flickers had transformed into undeniable realities. The sense of superiority Rachel had experienced just hours earlier now seemed like nothing more than foolish pride. As she headed back to the galley, her thoughts were a chaotic jumble. The tension in the cabin had not eased. In fact, it had intensified. The passengers were no longer merely confused. They were beginning to express their anger. Some had started to voice their frustrations more openly, demanding answers and questioning why they hadn't been informed sooner about the cancellation. A few whispered about their missed connections were strained as their vacations were disrupted by the delay, and Rachel's mind raced with thoughts of how much worse things would become. Upon reaching the galley, she encountered Mark Sullivan, who had been observing her closely. He refrained from asking questions, his keen eyes already picking up on the tension in the atmosphere. Rachel sensed that he was aware something had gone terribly awry. Have you spoken to the captain? Mark Sullivan spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper so that only Rachel could hear. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, lost in her thoughts. Still in shock, she realized there was nothing she could say to rectify the situation. No justification that could undo what had transpired. She had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. I've never seen you like this, Mark Sullivan remarked, his tone now softer, almost filled with compassion. What happened with her? Why was she moved? Rachel inhaled deeply, the burden of her guilt weighing heavily on her. She could no longer keep it inside. It was a mistake, she confessed, her voice barely audible. I thought she didn't belong in first class. I thought she'd made an error with her ticket. Booking I didn't check properly. I just assumed she didn't belong there. Mark Sullivan frowned, his disappointment evident. You assumed? That's not a good enough reason, Rachel. You've been here long enough to know that, she replied, her voice wavering slightly. I messed up, but I didn't know who she was. If I had known... She trailed off, unable to complete her thought. The weight of her mistake was overwhelming, but it was too late to rectify anything now. Mark Sullivan sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. You need to fix this, Rachel. If what... What you're saying is indeed true, we're heading into a serious predicament. His tone was serious, yet it carried an undercurrent of worry. You can't simply disregard someone like that, especially when they wield such influence. You've unleashed a situation that can't be reversed now. Rachel felt a lump in her throat, the tension in her stomach intensifying. She yearned to take action, to remedy the situation, but she was at a loss for where to start. She had made a choice driven by prejudice, and now she was facing the consequences. And Kara was already far beyond her grasp. The woman had maneuvered her strategy flawlessly, and it became evident that Rachel was merely a pawn in a game she hadn't even realized she was part of. As the minutes stretched on, Rachel's mind shifted to the passengers. They were becoming increasingly restless, their murmurs escalating into a chorus of frustration and anger. She knew she needed to address them, to soothe their rising tempers. But how could she articulate a situation that was beyond her comprehension? Just then, a flight attendant appeared in the galley, silently handing Rachel a phone. In that instant, Rachel's heart plummeted. As she glanced at the number displayed on the screen, the attendant remarked with an uncertain tone, "It's for you." Rachel accepted the phone with trembling hands, her mind racing toward the worst possible outcomes. She paused briefly before responding, "Hello," attempting to steady her voice, though it emerged faint. "Rachel," a cold and authoritative voice replied from the other end. "This is the executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding an incident involving a first-class passenger. We will require you to submit a detailed report upon landing. For the time being, ensure that all passengers are treated with respect and avoid making any further changes to seating arrangements without valid reasons." Rachel felt a sinking feeling as she absorbed the message. It was a formal complaint. This was no longer just a matter between her and Kara. It had escalated to the highest echelons of the airline, and she could sense the repercussions of her actions starting to unfold. "Yes, of course," Rachel replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll ensure everything is taken care of." The call concluded. Rachel stood there paralyzed as the gravity of the situation enveloped her. This was more than just a flight delay. It was a pivotal moment. Everything she had dedicated herself to, everything she had constructed in her career, was now at stake. She was the one who had erred, and now she would have to confront the consequences. Her eyes drifted to Mark Sullivan, who observed her in silence, a blend of concern and disbelief etched on his face. No words were necessary. The reality was evident. Rachel had made a choice, and the repercussions were already in motion. Consequences were now set in motion, and no one, least of all her, could halt them. The plane vibrated gently as it soared at altitude, the engines humming steadily in the background. Yet within the cabin, the tension was thick. Rachel's earlier confidence that everything would be all right had faded away. The announcement regarding the flight cancellation had left passengers bewildered, and some had started to express their dissatisfaction more vocally. The murmurs of frustration had escalated into amidst the barrage of questions, complaints, and furious demands for answers. Rachel remained by the galley, still clutching the phone. Her mind replayed every word from the executive office, and she felt the gravity of their message weigh heavily on her. "We'll need you to provide a detailed report upon landing." That was her sole task now, craft an explanation. Yet deep down, she understood that the report wouldn't absolve her. She had made a significant error. Carrara's call had set everything in motion, and now the consequences were starting to unfold. Rachel gazed out over the cabin. Her gaze swept over the rows of passengers, all still bewildered, though some were beginning to regard her with suspicion. She could see it in their eyes. They sensed that something was amiss. Rachel had always been capable, but today she felt diminished. The significance of her role as a flight attendant seemed to fade away. She was no longer in command. Carrara, seated at the back of the plane, was the sole exception, remaining calm and serene, showing no signs of panic or worry about the cancellation. In fact, she appeared almost pleased. Kara had anticipated every twist and turn. She wasn't merely along for the ride. She was the one piloting this plane, orchestrating events from the shadows, while Rachel and the rest of the team rushed to address the unforeseen chaos. Rachel glanced at Mark Sullivan, striving to maintain her composure. "I need to resolve this. I can't allow it to escalate," she asserted, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. The anxiety eating away at her was undeniable. She had misjudged Kara, and now the consequences were unfolding before her. Rachel sensed Carrara's next move approaching, the repercussions already set in motion. Mark Sullivan shot her a sideways look. "Rachel, you're in over your head. You need to get to the cockpit and involve the captain. We have to address this properly before we land, or we could be in serious trouble." His tone was stern, yet there was a kernel of truth in his warning. Rachel felt uncertain that anything could salvage her situation now. The flight attendants were starting to congregate near the galley, exchanging anxious glances. Though no one voiced their concerns, the tension was palpable. The tension weighed heavily on everyone. Rachel sensed that they were all looking to her to regain control and rectify the chaos she had caused. However, she felt uncertain about her ability to do so. The nagging thought that Carrara's presence had already cast a shadow over this flight lingered in her mind. She was not just another passenger, she was a formidable force, and Rachel had no clue how far her influence extended. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Carrara maintained her composure, seemingly unfazed by the turmoil. A subtle smile graced her lips, exuding an air of quiet confidence. She felt a sense of satisfaction, understanding that the flight was merely the start. Her focus wasn't on trivial revenge. Rather, it was about delivering a message, one that would resonate well beyond this single journey. As the plane descended, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly charged. Passengers transitioned from mere annoyance over the delay to palpable anxiety. Many had already taken out their phones, checking alternative flight options, sending texts, and making calls. The realization that they were trapped mid-flight without clear answers began to settle in. The murmurs of frustration grew louder, and the flight attendants sensed the mounting pressure. Rachel stood by the galley, attempting to blend into the background. She felt like a mere shadow, her presence largely overlooked by passengers consumed by their own grievances. Yet she couldn't shake the heavy burden of the circumstances. Each passing minute edged her closer to an inevitable confrontation she wasn't prepared for. The call from the executive office had delivered a stark warning. She had made a significant mistake. She found herself anticipating the aftermath. The intercom buzzed once more, causing Rachel's heart to race. The captain's voice resonated, calm and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for descent and will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your belongings are secured." While the announcement was standard procedure, the passengers perceived it in a different light. Their thoughts shifted from a smooth landing to a growing concern about what else might be unfolding, questioning if there was more behind this cancellation. More than anyone had anticipated, Rachel cast a glance at Mark Sullivan, who stood by the galley with his arms crossed, observing her intently. His eyes reflected deep concern, yet there was little he could do. The plane was already descending, and the damage was irreversible. All that remained was to confront the aftermath. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat parched as she contemplated the consequences awaiting them upon landing. Uncertainty loomed over her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation had spiraled beyond her control, leaving her with a sense of dread that it was more than she could bear. Meanwhile, Kara sat quietly in her seat, gazing out the window. Her serene expression had remained unchanged since her relocation to economy. In fact, she appeared more at ease now than at the beginning of the flight. She felt no concern about the cancellation. It was all part of her strategy, and everything was progressing as she had planned. As the plane began its descent through the clouds, Kara's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at it momentarily before typing a swift reply. There was no rush. Her next move was already underway. Meanwhile, Rachel was desperately trying to find a way to resolve the situation, but it was beyond repair. The sequence of events had already begun, and there was no turning back. Kara had achieved her goal without needing to take any further action. The flight attendants remained oblivious. The passengers were engulfed in bewilderment, and Rachel found herself teetering on the brink of her own collapse as the plane plunged deeper into the cloud cover, the atmosphere in the cabin heavy with apprehension. The expressions around her revealed a blend of confusion and mounting frustration as the flight attendants proceeded down the aisles, offering beverages. However, their typical cheerful demeanor had shifted to one of restrained professionalism, indicating they were just as uneasy as the passengers. Rachel, unable to overlook the escalating tension, made her way toward the front of the plane, frequently glancing back at Kara's seat. Kara remained unmoved since Rachel's last look, her composure flawless as always, though her eyes told a different story, were concentrated on something beyond the view outside the window. It felt as though she possessed knowledge that the others lacked. The notion sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Kara was unlike any other passenger Rachel had ever met. She remained unfazed by the turmoil, made no demands for explanations, and displayed no signs of irritation. In fact, she was the sole individual who appeared to have complete command of the situation. Rachel couldn't dismiss the sensation that every single occurrence had been meticulously planned. She had seen it before in films and literature, Yet she had never genuinely thought it could occur in her own life. It felt as though she had unknowingly stepped into a snare, with Kara observing from the periphery as everything she had constructed started to fall apart. "Do you require anything else?" One of the flight attendants inquired about Rachel, her voice laced with worry. Rachel shook her head, her thoughts still in disarray. "No, I'm fine," she whispered, even though she felt anything but fine. Her hands quivered as she reached for a glass of water from the cart. But just as she was about to drink, the intercom interrupted. The intercom buzzed once more, but this time the announcement came not from the captain. Instead, it was a formal message from the airline's executive office, directed specifically at Rachel. "Attention, flight crew," the voice intoned, cold and professional. "We have received an urgent complaint concerning the incident involving Miss Naomi Carter. She has indicated that she is affiliated with the airline's board of directors. Consequently, we request that you maintain the highest level of professionalism and respect for the duration of the flight. Failure to do so may result in..." Adhering to these instructions is crucial, as failure to do so may lead to additional disciplinary measures. Rachel felt her face pale as the message concluded. Her fingers stiffened around the water glass, the gravity of what she had just learned dawning on her. The board of directors. Kara had never revealed her true identity. How could Rachel have overlooked this? It was evident now that Kara was not just any passenger. She possessed the influence to compel the airline's top executives to respond. The enormity of her oversight settled heavily in her stomach. It was in that moment that Rachel first understood the true extent of the predicament she had created for herself. As the announcement persisted, her mind raced. She realized she had no option but to comply with the directives, regardless of how uneasy it made her. The harm was already inflicted. Carrara's stance was more than just a nuisance. It was a direct affront to everything Rachel had believed. Carrara had seized control of the situation, leaving Rachel to brace for the consequences. The final moments before landing stretched on endlessly as Rachel navigated through the aisles, making courteous yet tense efforts to connect with passengers, even as her thoughts drifted far from the usual duties of her role. Each time her gaze returned to Carrara, she found only serene composure. It felt as though Rachel bore the burdens of the world, while Kara remained untroubled. Rachel recognized that she had brought this upon herself, having hastily judged that Kara didn't deserve a place in first class, and now she was dealing with the fallout. In contrast, Carrara remained unaffected by the turmoil surrounding her. She felt neither upset nor angry, nor did she worry about what lay ahead. She had made her decision, set the plan in motion, and now all that remained was to wait. Her tranquility unsettled Rachel, who was accustomed to managing disruptions and swiftly resolving conflicts. But this was unlike anything she had faced. Kara was not merely a passenger, she was a significant force in this scenario, leaving Rachel feeling powerless. The plane's descent appeared to stretch on longer than usual, and Rachel sensed the gaze of the passengers upon her. No longer merely curious about the unfolding situation, the passengers were now watching her, anticipating her resolution. Carrara's calm authority had transformed the flight into something far beyond a mere journey. The tension in the cabin had evolved. Passengers were no longer just frustrated about the cancellation, but were beginning to question Rachel's leadership. What they were witnessing was a woman who had not taken control. By the time the plane finally landed, Rachel could feel the weight of her misstep pressing heavily on her. Her neck tensed the instant the seatbelt sign turned off. The typical flurry of passengers collecting their things felt muted, the heaviness of the cancellation still hanging in the atmosphere, accompanied by a soft murmur of conversation. Rachel's actions were rigid and automatic as she readied herself to leave the plane. Her hands trembled, and each step toward the exit felt increasingly burdensome. As the final passengers began to exit, Rachel inhaled deeply and cast one last look at Carrara. Carrara remained seated, her demeanor unshaken, eyes fixed on an unseen point. For a brief moment, their gazes met in a silent exchange, and in that instant, Rachel understood that the storm she had been dreading had already arrived. With nothing but a serene smile, Kara had triumphed. As Rachel mustered a smile for the last few departing passengers, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She recognized that her error was not something easily dismissed, And as people disembarked from the plane, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she was about to confront the full force of Carrara's influence. Standing by the door, Rachel forced a smile at the departing passengers, acutely aware of how each second felt like an eternity. She had been involved in something far more significant than she had understood, and now she found herself merely a spectator to the aftermath. The passengers filtered past her, some still complaining about the cancellation, while others were too preoccupied to notice. Their own frustrations kept them from paying her much attention, but a few cast suspicious glances her way. One man in particular lingered near the exit, giving her a long, hard look before departing the plane. His eyes conveyed everything Rachel dreaded to hear. As the last passenger finally exited, Rachel leaned against the galley wall with a heavy sigh. Her head felt foggy, and her body was tense, not just from the flight's stress, but from the overwhelming reality of what had just transpired. Everything she had strived for was now at risk. This was no minor error, but a blunder so grave that it had already undermined the very core of her career. And it was all due to Naomi Carter, who had expertly navigated the situation from the beginning. Rachel made her way toward the cockpit, her legs heavy as she moved down the aisle. The captain would undoubtedly be waiting for her, but there was nothing she could say to rectify the situation. The harm was already done, and the consequences were unavoidable as she approached the cockpit. At the door, she paused briefly before knocking gently. The captain's voice came from within, prompting Rachel to enter, her anxiety evident in her every action. Captain Robert Ellis glanced up, his demeanor serious, and motioned for Rachel to take a seat. "Rachel, we need to discuss what occurred," he stated, his tone weighty. "The executive office has already reached out to me. They are requesting a complete report on the incident." Rachel nodded slowly, her throat constricted. She had already rehearsed her words, but now that the moment had come, they seemed empty. "I made a mistake," she said softly. "I assumed that Naomi Carter didn't belong in first class. I didn't check her ticket properly before asking her to move. It was a hasty decision, and I realize that now." Captain Robert Ellis nodded solemnly. "You've made a grave mistake in judgment. Rachel, Naomi Carter isn't merely a random passenger. She has connections to the board of directors, which means her influence extends well beyond this aircraft. The way you treated her has already been elevated to the highest levels. This situation is beyond our control." Rachel's stomach sank. She had sensed the severity of the situation, but hearing it from the captain made it feel like an inescapable catastrophe. "What happens now?" she inquired, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "We'll manage the situation at the airline's headquarters," Captain Robert Ellis responded, stating that regarding this flight, your actions have caused more damage than benefit. We must adhere to protocol, but it's evident that your choices have repercussions that extend beyond this flight. The captain's words struck Rachel more deeply than she expected. She had always taken pride in being a skilled flight attendant, capable of managing the toughest situations with poise. However, this time was different. She had misjudged someone important, and now she was confronting the aftermath. As Rachel sat in the cockpit, her thoughts were still in turmoil. As the captain spoke, she felt increasingly trapped within herself. The atmosphere was heavy, and the silence shared with Captain Robert Ellis felt nearly unbearable. Each word he uttered struck her with greater weight than the one before, and the truth of her actions was becoming undeniable. She had believed she was in command of the situation, but Kara had revealed just how mistaken she was. Now, with the airline involved, Rachel's choices were facing severe examination, and there was no avoiding the consequences that lay ahead. His expression stayed serious as he outlined the next steps. "We'll meet with the ground team once we land," he stated. "The board expects a complete report, and we must ensure everything is documented correctly. You will need to present your perspective, but don't anticipate any leniency. The airline treats issues like this with utmost seriousness." Rachel nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened with each word. She felt exposed and vulnerable. Everything she had built in her career seemed at risk, was fading rapidly. Rachel had been hasty in her judgment of Carrara, quick to conclude that she didn't fit in first class. Yet now the reality was undeniable. Carrara was not merely a passenger, she possessed influence. wielding more authority in this scenario than Rachel had ever anticipated. As the plane descended toward the runway, Rachel's mind drifted back to Carrara. She hadn't laid eyes on her since the flight attendants had navigated through the cabin after the announcement. Carrara had stayed seated, poised and seemingly unfazed by the unfolding events. The drama surrounding her seemed almost preordained. It was as if she had anticipated every twist and turn. Carrara's calm and composed demeanor had been pivotal to her success. She hadn't resisted, nor had she raised her voice. She had merely made a single call and allowed the system to operate in her favor. Rachel's thoughts raced as she grasped the magnitude of her error. It wasn't merely about relocating a passenger from one seat to another. It encompassed her assumptions, her biases, and her failure to recognize the broader context. She had been overly fixated on enforcing the governed by her limited perspective, and now she was facing the repercussions. The captain cleared his throat, interrupting Rachel's thoughts. "Once we land, we need to meet with the ground crew. Prepare yourself, Rachel. You'll soon confront the consequences of your actions. There's no avoiding that now." Rachel nodded once more, the gravity of the situation pressing heavily upon her. She was on the brink of entering a meeting that had the potential to alter everything, and she understood there was no escape. She had misjudged Carrara, and now she was about to discover just how expensive that error would prove to be. The plane finally landed smoothly, but for Rachel it felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her. As the wheels made contact with the tarmac, she could sense her entire body tense, as if bracing for an unprecedented experience. Never before had she felt so vulnerable in her years as a flight attendant. The familiar hum of the cabin and the usual sounds of passengers collecting their belongings seemed far away now. Her mind was ensnared in a haze of anxiety, replaying the captain's words, the announcement, and especially the composed demeanor of Carrara. Gradually, the passengers started to unfasten their seatbelts. Some headed to the overhead bins to grab their bags, while others remained seated, still absorbing the news. Yet no one noticed Rachel. She blended into the background, just another element of the scene. Now, an unseen presence amidst the turmoil she had instigated, she exited the cockpit and entered the main cabin, striving to uphold a facade of calm. Yet her hands revealed her unease as they trembled while she walked down the aisle. She cast a glance at Carrara, who remained seated in the same position as before. Carrara's expression was unwavering, exuding calmness and poise. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and there was no trace of satisfaction or smugness in Carrara's gaze. It was as if she had foreseen everything. As Rachel approached the galley, she could hear the other flight attendants whispering softly among themselves, discussing the cancellation and speculating about the true events. Rachel caught snippets of their conversation regarding the significant passenger in the back, but none of them grasped the seriousness of the situation. They were unaware of Kara's true identity. Rachel felt a mix of relief and dread at their ignorance, but there was no time to dwell on it. She couldn't shake the thought that the ground crew would soon be there to confront her, and she had to confront the repercussions of her choices. Each step felt increasingly burdensome. She had attempted to sidestep the fallout, but it was now inescapable. Kara had triumphed in this conflict before it had even commenced, and Rachel had unwittingly walked straight into the tempest. Rachel's heart raced as she approached the exit, a sense of dread gnawing at her. The finality of the situation loomed closer, and she could hear the whispers of the other passengers as they passed her on their way out. Eyes flickered toward her, some filled with suspicion, others brimming with curiosity. She couldn't tell if they grasped what had transpired or if they merely sensed the tension that had been escalating during the flight. Yet for Rachel, that was irrelevant. The pressing concern now was the impending confrontation with the ground team. As she made her way down the narrow corridor toward the gate, her steps began to slow, her mind swirling with a haze of thoughts. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't ready to confront the repercussions of her choices, particularly given their extensive consequences. She had regarded Kara as just another passenger, failing to recognize her true nature. Kara was not merely a casualty of Rachel's error. She was a key player in the turmoil that was now unraveling, leaving Rachel to confront the aftermath. At the gate, the ground crew awaited their arrival, devoid of any warm welcome or friendly banter. They understood the reason for Rachel's presence, and their expressions reflected it. There was no compassion, no understanding, only a focus on the task at hand. She sensed their gaze upon her as she drew near, aware that they had already been informed about the events of the flight. The ground team leader, a tall man with defined features, moved closer. His face remained impassive, yet there was an unsettling glint in his eyes that made Rachel's stomach churn. "Jessica Lane?" he inquired, his voice steady. Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes," she replied softly, struggling to maintain eye contact. "We've been informed about the incident involving Miss Naomi Carter. We'll need to discuss what occurred on the flight," the man stated with a serious tone. Was courteous, yet it held a weight of seriousness that left Rachel feeling unsteady as the team guided her to a small, sterile conference room. She couldn't dispel the sense that she was approaching something unavoidable. She had erred, and now it was time to confront the repercussions of that error directly. The room was frigid and devoid of warmth, and Rachel's breath hitched as she settled into a chair at the table. The ground team leader and two other officials lingered by the door, their expressions somber, with Carrara's name hanging heavily in the air. The entire situation weighed heavily on Rachel, the tension from the past few hours palpable in the air. The ground team leader exchanged glances with the other two officials before addressing her again. "Rachel, we've assessed the situation. The executive office has already escalated this matter. Ms. Williams is not only a regular passenger with us, but she also holds considerable influence within the airline's board of directors. Her complaint regarding mistreatment has been officially recorded, and the board is currently reviewing it." Rachel felt her face heat up. Despite the heat of the moment, she stayed quiet, lacking any defense or justification that could rectify the situation. She had thought Carrara was merely another passenger, someone who could be easily overlooked, but she had misjudged. Carrara had flipped the script, and now Rachel was facing the consequences. The man kept his gaze fixed on her, stating, "You are in violation of our airline's code of conduct. Not only did you remove a passenger from her designated seat, but you did so based on assumptions and biases that are unacceptable. We will be escalating this matter to the disciplinary committee, requires you to submit a formal statement detailing your actions." Rachel felt a sinking sensation. Each word struck her like a hammer, reinforcing the gravity of her predicament. She had rushed into her decisions, acted impulsively, and now the consequences were catching up with her. The weight of her error bore down on her, and there was no escape. The ground team leader's tone was calm as he outlined the next steps. "You will be suspended while we await the outcome of the committee will determine your future with this company," he stated. "I recommend you use this time to contemplate your actions." The atmosphere in the room grew stifling, and Rachel felt as if the walls were closing in. She was at a loss for words. She had already been defeated. Underestimating Kara had led her to this moment, and now she had to confront the repercussions. The storm had arrived, leaving her exposed to the fallout of her choices. The following days passed in a disorienting haze as Rachel faced suspension from her responsibilities while the airline's disciplinary committee evaluated her conduct. The gravity of the situation lingered with her at every turn, a persistent reminder of her misstep. Her phone rested on the table next to her, notifications from family and friends accumulating, yet she found herself unable to respond. What could she possibly say? How could she articulate the events that had unfolded when she struggled to comprehend them herself? Her mind repeatedly drifted back to Carrara, who had navigated everything with such serene assurance. Carrara had never shouted or sought preferential treatment. She had merely made a call, and in doing so had completely transformed the situation. It was no longer merely about a seat on a plane. It had evolved into a matter of power, influence, and the astonishing speed with which one could dismantle an entire system with a single calculated action. Rachel found herself engulfed in a fog of regret. She had been part of an industry that valued fairness and respect, yet she had let her biases obscure her judgment. She had presumed Kara to be just another ordinary passenger, someone easily overlooked. But Kara was far more than that. At 1 o'clock in 11 seconds, Rachel found herself facing the consequences of her oversight regarding the disciplinary hearing, which arrived unexpectedly. As she entered the headquarters, She felt diminutive and vulnerable, as if the very walls were constricting around her. Seated in a stark conference room, she was surrounded by senior airline executives, their expressions grave as they scrutinized the particulars of the incident. The ambiance was frigid, and Rachel was unable to dispel the sense that her career was precariously at stake. In that moment, the atmosphere was devoid of solace, offering no assurance that everything would turn out fine. All she could do was remain seated, bracing herself for the impending judgment. The hearing was brief yet charged, with each statement from the executives serving as a stark reminder of her missteps. When they requested her to clarify her actions, Rachel complied. But her explanations felt empty, devoid of the sincerity they sought. She acknowledged her impulsive behavior, admitting to relocating Carrara from her position without adequate verification, and detailed how she had. Based on Carrara's appearance, it was assumed she didn't fit in with first class. The executives listened in silence, their gazes fixed on her, but Rachel realized they weren't absorbing her explanation. They were focused on her errors. The questioning seemed unending, with each inquiry adding to the heavy load she bore. What began as a minor misunderstanding had escalated into a formal evaluation of her entire career. The airline's reputation was at stake, and Rachel's actions had significantly contributed to the harm. Every word she uttered felt like a weight on her shoulders, felt like an additional affirmation of her failure. The more she attempted to justify herself, the clearer it became that no words could reverse the damage she had inflicted. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, silence enveloped the room. The executives shared glances, their expressions inscrutable. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she awaited their response. She was uncertain of what to anticipate, yet she understood that whatever followed would be the climax of everything that had transpired since that ill-fated flight. "We've reviewed your case, Rachel," the lead began. The executive stated in a measured tone that your actions were in direct violation of the airline's policies. Not only did you misinterpret a passenger's behavior, but your assumptions also impaired your judgment. The incident involving Ms. Williams is significant and has already led to consequences within the company. You will be placed on a probationary period, and your future with this airline will hinge on your actions moving forward. Rachel nodded slowly, her stomach sinking. It wasn't a termination, but it wasn't a fresh start either. She had been given an opportunity, yet she understood it came with conditions. Her career in the airline industry was precarious, and the path ahead was anything but clear. However, one thing Rachel was sure of was that she would never repeat the same mistake. She had learned the hard way that assumptions, particularly those based on appearances, could lead to significant consequences. Weeks went by, and life gradually began to resemble a sense of normalcy once more. Rachel remained reserved, diligently carrying out her responsibilities while under the scrutiny of her superiors. Her probation period served as a persistent reminder of her past mistake, yet it also provided her with an opportunity for introspection. She had experienced a humbling moment, and despite the lingering pain of her error, Rachel was resolute in her commitment to learn from it. In contrast, Carrara had progressed. She had leveraged her influence to initiate changes within the airline. Rachel caught wind of discussions regarding new updates to sensitivity training. The airline's protocols and a stronger dedication to equity had positioned Kara as a symbol of the transformation she had initiated, earning Rachel's admiration for her foresight. Kara was more than just a passenger. She was a catalyst for change, leveraging her influence to ensure her message resonated. One afternoon, while Rachel was in the break room enjoying her coffee, she caught snippets of a discussion among several flight attendants regarding the recent developments within the airline. Commending the new training programs and their effectiveness in assisting the crew with delicate situations, Rachel stayed quiet. Yet internally, she grappled with a sense of accountability. She had once contributed to a problem, but now she was part of the remedy. Rachel's journey was far from complete. She still had much to learn. However, she had grasped a crucial lesson. Carrara's calm resilience and strategic mindset had revealed to her that true power stemmed not just from authority, but from comprehending the system, knowing how to maneuver within it, and, most importantly, Rachel had learned the importance of demanding respect when it was warranted, though it had come through difficult experiences. She was determined to progress, to improve herself and to make sure that past errors would not be repeated. As she made her way back to her designated gate, the burden of her previous actions still hovered, yet it no longer defined her. She had confronted the repercussions and emerged with a deeper insight. With this newfound clarity, she felt prepared to face whatever lay ahead, approaching it with the grace and respect she had once overlooked. The future was unpredictable, yet Rachel was certain of one thing. She would always remember the lessons gained from that singular flight and the woman who had transformed her perspective. The story of Rachel and Naomi Carter teaches us a powerful lesson. Don't judge people based on their appearance or personal biases. Rachel was quick to judge Naomi, which led to serious consequences for her career. This lesson emphasizes the importance of respect, fairness, and careful consideration before acting. In today's America, where cultural and ethnic diversity is a hallmark, this lesson is even more important. Unconscious bias still exists in environments such as the workplace, customer service, and everyday life. Applying this lesson requires us to listen, verify information, and treat everyone fairly, regardless of background or appearance. Companies in the U.S. are increasing cultural sensitivity and fairness training, similar to the change Naomi pushed for. Individuals need to be self-aware, avoid hasty judgments, and cultivate empathy. Not only does this build an inclusive environment, it also helps avoid unfortunate mistakes, like Rachel's.